In the long legacy of American folklore, few figures capture the imagination quite like Johnny Appleseed. While many frontier heroes gained fame through acts of strength or daring, Johnny Appleseed's legacy grew from gentler sprouts, compassion, conservation, and an unwavering spiritual devotion. The tales that surrounded him during his life and flourished after his death painted a portrait of an eccentric yet purposeful man who walked barefoot through the wilderness, wore a cooking pot as a hat, and conversed with angels while planting apple orchards across the American frontier. Yet beneath these colorful stories lay a real historical figure whose actual accomplishments proved as remarkable as the legends they inspired. The interweaving of fact and folklore in Johnny Appleseed's story reveals not just the life of one extraordinary individual, but also the values, hopes, and beliefs of a young nation finding its identity in the vast wilderness of the American frontier. For Footprints of the Frontier, this is American Quests, and a deeper dive into the legends and lore of John Chapman, or better known as Johnny Appleseed. The American West, often referred to as the Far West in the post-colonial age, lost its raw, untamed character when railroad expansion brought modern conveniences to these remote territories. As trains penetrated the wilderness, they eclipsed the challenging yet romantic era of pioneer life that had demanded tremendous fortitude. The arduous expeditions that early settlers once undertook, traveling vast distances for basic supplies and conducting hazardous trading missions along treacherous waterways, gave way to swift rail delivery. While penny publications and sensational accounts focused heavily on violent clashes between settlers and indigenous peoples, the authentic chronicles of frontier existence often revealed quieter tales of resourcefulness and determination. Among these lesser celebrated pioneers stood Jonathan Chapman, who gained recognition as Johnny Appleseed. Though his reputation eventually diminished to mere frontier folklore, his accomplishments demonstrated remarkable foresight and dedication. Appleseed was born in Leominster, Massachusetts, on September 26, 1774. His parents, Nathaniel and Elizabeth Chapman, had married 4 years prior in February 1770. A stone memorial now marks his birthplace along a roadway that adapted his legendary nickname, Johnny Appleseed Lane. Tragedy touched Chapman's childhood early on, when his mother Elizabeth died in 1776, following the delivery of his brother Nathaniel Jr., who survived himself only briefly. His father found new companionship in 1780, wedding Lucy Cooley and establishing roots in Longmeadow, Massachusetts, where they expanded their household considerably. Historical accounts painted contrasting portraits of the Chapman siblings. According to biographer Rosella Rice, Chapman's sister, who resided in Indiana, exhibited characteristics markedly different from her famous brother. While he maintained a reserved and unconventional nature, she displayed more conventional traits, engaging in animated conversation, peppered with arguments. Chapman was more agreeable and conflict avoidant. At 18 years old in 1792, Chapman initiated his westward expedition, convincing his 11-year-old half-brother, Nathaniel Cooley Chapman, to accompany him. The pair wandered the frontier territories until 1805, when their father relocated the remainder of the family to Ohio. At this juncture, Nathaniel elected to assist with his family's agricultural pursuits, while John charted his own independent course. Following the separation, Chapman discovered his life's calling through an apprenticeship with an experienced orchardist named Mr. Crawford. This formative period provided the knowledge and inspiration that potentially shaped his future mission of establishing apple orchards throughout the frontier regions. By his 26th birthday in 1800, Chapman had initiated his legendary work. he established residence near Ohio's Licking River, where he cultivated his inaugural orchard on Isaac Stadden's property in the area that subsequently became Licking County. His apple planting odyssey commenced in 1801 on Ohio's Licking Creek, where he first scattered his treasured seeds. This modest beginning launched an extraordinary career that witnessed Chapman traversing the Midwest barefooted, distributing apple seeds and cultivating orchards. His efforts not only provided sustenance for frontier settlements, but created an enduring symbol of pioneering spirit and selfless contribution to American expansion. The driving force behind his unique calling remains enigmatic to this day. His singular devotion to spreading apple orchards across uninhabited regions might have stemmed from personal loss, an unusual mission, or simply extraordinary generosity. He gathered his precious cargo from cider operations in Pennsylvania, typically transporting them by foot or on horseback. That was until Johnny Appleseed's celebrated 1806 riverbound journey deeper into the frontier. This notable 1806 expedition occurred when Chapman steered a makeshift vessel, two canoes bound together, brimming with apple seeds. The ambitious route wound through multiple Ohio waterways, beginning at the Ohio River near Marietta, continuing through the Muskingum, Walhonding, and Mohican rivers, before reaching its destination in what later became Ashland and Richland counties. Throughout this challenging voyage, Chapman halted periodically to establish orchards in locations he deemed promising for future communities. His expeditions covered extensive distances through challenging wilderness terrain. Durable leather pouches protected his valuable seeds during these frontier crossings. At carefully selected spots, often picturesque creekside locations sheltered by grand trees, Chapman established nurseries, crafting basic fencing to shield young trees until pioneers arrived to claim them. The untamed regions Chapman traversed featured both magnificent vistas and formidable challenges. Luxuriant vegetation choked the frontier's waterways and valleys, where climbing plants and wildflowers flourished beneath massive trees. The wilderness teemed with creatures, from docile deer to fierce bears, including surprisingly dangerous feral hogs. Poisonous snakes lurking in high grass posed an ever-present threat to travelers. Nevertheless, Chapman ventured barefooted into these perilous territories, determined to plant the seeds that would eventually sustain and beautify growing communities. Chapman demonstrated artistic sensitivity in positioning his orchards, selecting sites that married natural splendor with practical considerations. These carefully chosen spaces, peaceful clearings near flowing water, embraced by ancient forests, offered settlers both sustenance and spiritual refreshment. During an age when basic survival often overshadowed environmental appreciation, his work exemplified the successful fusion of necessity and natural beauty. Johnny Appleseed's physical characteristics and unconventional habits made him an unforgettable presence on the frontier. His slight yet brawny frame suited his nomadic existence, while his deep-set black eyes, sparse facial hair, and lengthy dark locks created an almost mystical impression. His approach to clothing defied conventional wisdom. He predominantly walked without shoes, regardless of weather conditions. When he did protect his feet, he often wore mismatched footwear discovered during his travels, perhaps combining an abandoned boot with a lone moccasin. Though financially capable of purchasing proper footwear, he deliberately chose not to. Historical accounts described an incident during a bitter November when a concerned settler provided Chapman with shoes, considering it morally wrong to traverse the frozen ground barefooted. However, upon encountering the benefactor days later, Chapman had returned to his shoeless state. He explained that he had given the footwear to a destitute family moving westward, believing their need exceeded his own. This charitable spirit extended to his attire, Initially accepting donated clothing in exchange for saplings, he later adopted an even simpler garment, a coffee sack modified with openings for his head and arms, which he considered perfectly sufficient. His choice of headgear proved equally remarkable. He initially employed a tin pot that served dual purposes as cookware, but later fashioned a more practical wide-brimmed hat from pasteboard after finding the metal container uncomfortable in bright sunlight. Despite his unusual appearance, Chapman's compassionate nature garnered widespread admiration. Both frontier dwellers and typically unruly children treated him with respect. He showed particular kindness to young ladies, presenting them with colorful fabric pieces and ribbons, gifts that remain cherished memories for many elderly women throughout Ohio and Indiana. His consideration extended to mealtimes, as he insisted on ensuring children received adequate portions before accepting food himself. Indigenous peoples regarded Chapman with particular reverence, viewing his peculiar behaviors and apparent immunity to physical discomfort as signs of spiritual power. He occasionally demonstrated this hardiness by enduring self-inflicted wounds or cauterizing injuries from his barefoot travels. During the War of 1812's heightened tensions, he moved freely among both settlers and Native Americans, often serving as a messenger. In one notable instance, he raced to warn settlements of approaching British and Native forces, delivering his message with religious fervor. Chapman embraced an austere lifestyle guided by strict principles. His commitment to nonviolence included refusing to harm animals for sustenance, instead relying on naturally available food sources. He strongly opposed food waste, once retrieving discarded bread from a pig feed while reproaching the wasteful household. By all accounts, Johnny Appleseed's legacy was taking shape into its final form. Religious devotion and environmental stewardship intertwined deeply in Johnny Appleseed's existence. His spiritual foundation rested on the philosophical teachings of Emanuel Swedenborg, a Swedish religious thinker whose works profoundly shaped his worldview. Chapman spoke of communications with supernatural beings and maintained that two angelic entities had pledged matrimonial union with him in heaven, provided he remained unmarried during his earthly existence. These convictions guided his daily actions, and he persistently carried Swedenborg's texts, sharing them enthusiastically with those he encountered. Chapman developed an unconventional method for disseminating Swedenborg's philosophy. He separated religious texts into portions, distributing different segments among various households, and returning later with the remaining sections. This approach enabled multiple readers to access single volumes simultaneously, though it resulted in a fragmented reading experience. He attributed protective qualities to those religious manuscripts, asserting that they safeguarded him from both physical and spiritual dangers during his westward quests. Chapman insisted that propagating apple trees through seed cultivation represented the only ethically sound approach, rejecting grafting and pruning techniques. He regarded apple trees as sacred creations, describing their attributes with such eloquence that listeners envisioned flourishing orchards in their minds. His extensive nursery network endured well beyond his lifetime, though he staunchly opposed any practices he perceived as damaging to trees, viewing such actions as violence against living entities. Chapman eventually gave his full favor towards seed propagation, despite the method's unpredictable outcomes. This method yielded predominantly inedible fruit. Approximately 99% of seed-grown apple trees produced fruit that proved too bitter for consumption. As Henry David Thoreau later observed, these apples possessed such intense sourness that they could theoretically cause squirrels to grimace and provoke birds to screech. Yet these tart fruits served a vital purpose in frontier society. Their characteristics made them perfectly suited for hard cider production, a beverage that dominated frontier consumption patterns during the early 1800s. The scale of cider consumption proved remarkable. Ohio's adult population averaged 30 gallons per person yearly, equating to nearly 11 ounces daily. Thus, Johnny Appleseed's apple orchards gained significance primarily through their contribution to alcoholic beverage production, rather than fresh fruit consumption. Historians have offered an alternative interpretation of Chapman's horticultural choices. They suggested that Chapman's dedication to seed propagation, despite its tendency to produce bitter fruit, reflected intentional planning rather than agricultural naivety. By establishing orchards that primarily supported cider production, Chapman effectively facilitated alcohol distribution throughout the frontier territories. This perspective explained Chapman's consistently warm reception among frontier households throughout both Ohio and Indiana. In this context, Chapman emerged as a frontier equivalent to Dionysus, disseminating the culture of fermented beverages across the wilderness. Animal welfare also occupied a central role in Chapman's mission. He frequently purchased mistreated or deserted animals, particularly horses abandoned by migrating settlers, providing rehabilitation and new homes without seeking financial gain. His consideration extended to the smallest of creatures. He once extinguished his campfire upon noticing moths perishing in the flames, and relocated his sleeping area upon discovering a bear family's den, prioritizing their well-being over his comfort. His pacifistic principles manifested even in moments of personal injury. During a road clearing project, when repeatedly stung by a trapped hornet, Chapman carefully freed the insect rather than harming it, explaining its unintentional nature. This exemplified his belief in the sacred value of all living creatures, regardless of size or perceived importance. Despite his unconventional lifestyle, Chapman demonstrated remarkable business acumen. He strategically established nurseries in areas anticipating future settlement, ensuring sapling availability when the pioneers arrived. His flexible payment arrangements included accepting various goods on future payment promises, though he rarely pursued unpaid debts. He directed any excess funds towards charitable causes, supporting struggling families and tending to injured animals. In a rare departure from his typical practices, Chapman purchased land in Ohio later in life, though, characteristically, he neglected to register the deed, eventually forfeiting the property. This incident illustrated his detachment from material possessions, as he concentrated instead on spreading the good word, establishing orchards, and addressing the hardships he encountered throughout his travels. Despite enduring numerous physical trials, Johnny Appleseed maintained an optimistic disposition throughout his final years. His dedication to emulating early Christian principles provided him with inner strength and satisfaction amid challenging circumstances. His witty personality occasionally surfaced in memorable ways. One notable demonstration of his humor unfolded during a religious gathering in Mansfield, Ohio. As a traveling minister admonished his congregation for embracing modern comforts like decorative textiles and commercial tea, repeatedly questioning the whereabouts of individuals who practiced austere living like ancient Christians, Chapman seized the moment. He approached the speaker, displayed his unshod foot upon the makeshift wooden podium, and gestured toward his rudimentary sackcloth attire, announcing himself as the sought-after example. Not all of Chapman's initiatives proved beneficial. His conviction regarding the healing properties of dog fennel, also known as mayweed, led him to distribute its seeds extensively, believing it would combat malaria. This plant subsequently became an agricultural pest, persisting as an unwanted species throughout Ohio's farmlands into modern times. By 1838, as civilization steadily advanced across Ohio's formerly untamed regions, Chapman recognized his role there had diminished. Witnessing the emergence of urban developments and infrastructure, he felt increasingly displaced. He departed from longtime acquaintances, including children who had matured listening to his tales and receiving his modest presence. He offered parting wisdom before continuing his mission in Indiana's less developed territories, where he'd spend the rest of his days. Chapman's life concluded peacefully in Allen County, Indiana, during the summer of 1847. After a day of traveling, he rested at a settler's residence, choosing to consume a simple meal of bread and milk outdoors while observing the sunset. That evening, he shared biblical passages with his hosts before sleeping on the floor according to his preference. The following morning, as his condition deteriorated, a physician remarked on his extraordinary tranquility in the face of death. At 72 years old, Johnny Appleseed had passed away. Johnny Appleseed's legacy is one of selfless devotion, compassion, and an unwavering connection to nature. He lived without wealth, comfort, or acclaim, yet his deeds profoundly shaped the landscape and spirit of the frontier. From his love for all living things, even the smallest creatures, to his tireless efforts to make the wilderness bloom, he embodied a rare and enduring form of heroism. Although no one knows the location of his final resting place, his memory lives on in the orchards he planted and the apple blossoms he cherished. His life stands as a reminder of the idea that greatness can arise from the humblest of circumstances. That true virtue is found not in grand displays, but in quiet, enduring acts of love and kindness, the most pure form of a true American legend.